The snow fell gently on the quiet streets of Pine Hollow, a small, picturesque town nestled in the mountains of Colorado. It was Christmas Eve, and every home seemed to glow with warmth, golden lights flickering through frosted windows. Families gathered around roaring fireplaces, children giggled as they unwrapped an early present, and carolers sang in harmony under the starlit sky. But outside the cozy walls, beyond the laughter and joy, something unexpected was unfolding, something both extraordinary and deeply moving. At the edge of Pine Hollow, where the forest stretched endlessly into the night, a black Labrador named Shadow paced back and forth, his paws crunching in the snow. Shadow wasn't just any dog. He was a loyal companion, one of those rare creatures whose connection to his family seemed almost human. For 7 years, he had been the heart of the Johnson household, a family who had come to Pine Hollow for a fresh start after tragedy. Rebecca, a single mother, had adopted Shadow from a rescue shelter shortly after her husband's passing. Her 8-year-old son, Max, had clung to the dog as if Shadow were the only anchor keeping him from drifting into despair. And, in many ways, he was. Shadow wasn't just Max's protector. He was his healer. Isn't it remarkable how animals have this innate ability to sense our emotions, to comfort us when we're at our lowest? Shadow wasn't just a pet. He was a living testament to how animals can transform human lives. Max's bond with Shadow was not just one of friendship, it was a lifeline, something many people have experienced when they've opened their hearts to a dog, a cat, or even a bird. But tonight, Shadow wasn't pacing outside the Johnson home. Instead, he stood alone at the edge of the woods, his sharp eyes scanning the darkness. The Labrador had always been protective, but now, his instincts were in overdrive. Something was wrong. Hours earlier, Max had gone missing. Rebecca had been decorating the Christmas tree when she noticed the front door ajar. Panic set in as she called Max's name, her voice echoing into the cold night. Neighbors joined the search, flashlights cutting through the snowy darkness. The police had been alerted, but the freezing temperatures made every minute critical. Somewhere out there, her little boy was lost in the wilderness, and Shadow, sensing the gravity of the situation, had bolted from the house in a desperate search for the child he loved. The Johnsons lived near the edge of Pine Hollow, where the woods could become treacherous after dark. The forest, while beautiful in daylight, was dense and unforgiving. Snowdrifts reached waist-high in some places, and the temperatures were plummeting well below freezing. Rebecca's heart ached as she imagined her son, scared and cold, wandering deeper into the wilderness. Shadow, however, seemed determined. He had sprinted out of the yard with a purpose, following a trail only his keen nose could detect. Rebecca's neighbors, the kind-hearted Morgans, had offered to drive her around the outskirts of the forest. Their SUV crawled along the snowy road, the headlights illuminating the thick wall of trees. Rebecca clutched Max's scarf, tears streaming down her face as she whispered prayers into the silence. Her mind raced with possibilities. Had he wandered off after the stray cat he'd been feeding? Was he hiding because of something he didn't want to confess? She couldn't understand why her son, her shy and gentle Max, would leave the safety of their home. Let me ask you something as you watch this. Have you ever seen firsthand how much love and care an animal can give, even in moments when we feel most alone? Shadow's actions that night were extraordinary, yes, but they were also part of a greater truth about animals: their ability to bridge the emotional gaps we humans sometimes can't fill ourselves. In fact, you might be surprised by the profound effects animals can have on mental health, especially for older adults. If you've ever had a moment where an animal comforted you, why not pause this video and share your story in the comments below? Your story might inspire someone else. Meanwhile, deep in the woods, Shadow's paws never stopped moving. His breath puffed out in clouds as he pressed forward, the snow clinging to his fur. The Labrador had picked up Max's scent near a small stream, and he followed it with unwavering focus. He didn't understand the concept of danger the way humans did, but he knew that Max needed him. And so, Shadow pushed through the snow, his heart racing with a sense of urgency that overpowered any fatigue or cold he felt. The child's trail led to a small clearing, where the trees thinned out and the moonlight spilled across the snow. And there, huddled beneath a thick pine tree, was Max. His tiny frame was trembling, his cheeks red and raw from the cold. He had wrapped his coat tightly around himself, but the cold was merciless. His lips quivered as he whispered Shadow's name, his voice weak and barely audible. Max had wandered too far from home, chasing after the elusive stray cat he'd been feeding for weeks. When he realized he was lost, panic set in, and he stumbled through the woods until exhaustion forced him to stop. Shadow bounded toward Max with a sense of relief so palpable it was almost visible. The boy's eyes widened as the Labrador reached him, and for a moment, tears of gratitude spilled down his frozen cheeks. "Shadow," he murmured, his voice breaking. The dog nuzzled him gently, his warm breath offering a small reprieve from the bitter cold. Shadow circled the boy, laying down beside him and pressing his warm body against Max's side. It was as if the dog knew that the only way to keep him alive was to shield him from the freezing air. As the hours dragged on, Shadow refused to leave Max's side. The Labrador was more than a guardian. He was a lifeline. Each time the boy shivered uncontrollably, Shadow would nuzzle closer, his deep brown eyes filled with silent determination. He barked into the night, a loud and desperate sound that echoed through the trees. But the forest swallowed the noise, and the rescuers searching near the edge of the woods couldn't hear him. For now, it was just the two of them against the elements, a boy and his dog, clinging to each other for survival. Back in the town, Rebecca's hope was fading. The police had expanded the search, but as midnight approached, the reality of the situation began to settle in. The temperatures were now dangerously low, and frostbite or hypothermia was a very real threat. Rebecca gripped her phone tightly, staring at the screen as if willing it to ring with good news. She thought of her husband, who had always been her source of strength, and wondered how she was supposed to endure the possibility of losing her son too. Somewhere deep inside, though, she held onto a fragile thread of faith. Faith in the strength of her boy and in the loyalty of the dog who had never let him down. Stories like these remind us of just how much animals give to us, often without expecting anything in return. Shadow's unwavering loyalty is not just a testament to his love for Max, but to the deeper, universal truth about the healing power of animals. And while this story may focus on Max, did you know that these same principles apply to older adults? It's true, and if you want to learn more about how animals can profoundly transform mental health, especially in later stages of life, stay with me until the end. I'll share something that might surprise you. Midnight came and went, the stillness of the forest broken only by the whisper of the wind weaving through the towering pines. Snowflakes continued to fall, blanketing the world in a white silence that felt more suffocating than serene. Rebecca sat in the Morgan's SUV, staring blankly at the windshield. Her hands trembled as she held Max's scarf close to her face, the faint scent of her son clinging to the fabric like a fading memory. She hadn't said a word in hours, her voice stolen by the gnawing fear in her chest. The police search team, now reinforced with volunteers from the town, combed through the woods with flashlights and thermal imaging cameras, but so far they had found nothing. The reality of the situation was setting in. A child alone in these conditions wouldn't survive much longer. Rebecca overheard two officers murmuring about how the temperatures had dropped below 10 degrees Fahrenheit. It was a race against time, and time was slipping away. But Shadow didn't know how to give up. Deep in the woods, Shadow lay curled tightly against Max, his black fur shimmering faintly under the moonlight. Max was barely awake now, his body trembling with cold. But even as the bitter wind bit into Shadow's own body, the Labrador didn't move. His instincts were clear: stay close, stay warm, keep the boy alive. Shadow nuzzled Max gently, licking his face each time he began to drift into a dangerous sleep. His bark echoed occasionally into the night, a desperate plea for help that no human could yet hear. Moments like these remind us of something profound. Animals are often much more than companions. They can act as protectors, emotional anchors, and even lifesavers in our darkest hours. If you've ever experienced something like this with your own pet, or know someone who has, pause this video for a moment and share your story in the comments. It might encourage someone watching to look at their own furry friend in a whole new light. Rebecca's hope, however, was starting to fade. She sat frozen in the passenger seat, staring blankly into the snowy void as the Morgan's SUV crawled along the forest edge. "He's out there," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "I can feel it." Beside her, Mrs. Morgan placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Shadow is with him," she said softly. "That dog would never leave Max. You have to hold on to that." Rebecca nodded weakly, her hands gripping Max's scarf tighter. Shadow had been her family's guardian ever since they brought him home. After losing her husband in a car accident 3 years ago, it was Shadow who helped her son begin to smile again. For families like Rebecca's, and perhaps even your own, dogs like Shadow have a way of filling emotional voids that no human words can heal. Research shows that pets aren't just companions, They can play critical roles in helping people process grief, overcome loneliness, and rebuild emotional resilience. But tonight, Rebecca feared that even Shadow's incredible loyalty wouldn't be enough. Her mind raced with terrifying possibilities. What if Max was already too cold? What if they didn't find him in time? Tears blurred her vision, and she whispered a prayer into the night. Please, just let them be okay. Meanwhile, Shadow's determination didn't waver. As Max's breaths grew shallow and the boy's shivering lessened, a dangerous sign, Shadow made a decision. He rose slowly, his legs stiff and shaking from the cold, and began to bark louder and more urgently than before. His deep, resonant voice carried through the trees, breaking the oppressive silence of the wilderness. Shadow didn't know how far his calls would carry, but his instincts told him this was the only chance to save his boy. Max stirred faintly at the sound, his tiny fingers brushing against Shadow's fur. "Shadow," he whispered weakly, his lips barely moving. The dog nudged him gently, his warm breath stirring Max's frozen cheeks. It was as though Shadow was saying, "Hold on, little one. I'm not giving up on you." Back at the forest's edge, Rebecca's SUV had stopped, the search party regrouping nearby. The police officers were preparing to send out another thermal imaging drone when suddenly, Officer Reynolds froze. "Wait," he said, holding up his hand. "Did you hear that?" Everyone stopped, ears straining. Faint but unmistakable, the sound of barking filtered through the still night. Rebecca's heart leapt. "That's Shadow," she cried, throwing open the car door and stumbling into the snow. "It's him. He's found Max. Stay with her." Reynolds barked to another officer as he radioed for backup. "We've got a lead. Let's move." Rebecca didn't wait for anyone's permission. She sprinted toward the sound, her boots slipping on the icy ground, her flashlight trembling in her hands. Her breath came in frantic gasps, the cold air burning her lungs, but she didn't care. "Max!" she screamed, her voice cracking. "Shadow!" At this moment, Rebecca wasn't just running toward her son. She was running toward hope, toward love, toward the kind of connection that only a dog like Shadow could create. If you've ever felt the comfort of a pet who knew just when you needed them most, you already understand the power of this bond. It's something we explore deeply in our ebook, How Animals Transform Human Mental Health in the Third Age. Whether you're struggling with loss, loneliness, or even the natural challenges of aging, animals can be a source of healing and renewal in ways you might not expect. Stay with me, and I'll share more about how you can learn from Shadow's story. Shadow barked again, louder this time, as the flickering beam of Rebecca's flashlight broke into the clearing. His deep brown eyes locked onto the approaching figure, his tail wagging faintly despite his exhaustion. Help was coming. His boy was going to be okay. Rebecca burst into the clearing, her flashlight dropping to the snow as she spotted them. Her son, small and pale but alive, and Shadow standing protectively over him. For a moment, all she could do was collapse to her knees, a guttural cry of relief escaping her lips. "Max," she sobbed, crawling toward him. Shadow stepped aside just enough for her to reach her son, his tired body swaying slightly from the effort. Rebecca pulled Max into her arms, cradling him as tears streamed down her face. "Oh my God," she whispered. "You're safe. You're safe." Max's eyelids fluttered open, and a faint smile crossed his lips. "Mom," he murmured weakly. "Shadow," he stayed. Rebecca looked at the dog, her tear-filled eyes meeting his. "You saved him," she whispered, her voice shaking. "You saved my boy." Shadow lowered himself to the snow, his job done, his body too exhausted to stand any longer. But even as his eyes closed briefly, his ears remained perked, still listening for the humans who would take them both home. Rebecca's heart thundered in her chest as she sprinted toward the sound of Shadow's barking. Each bark was like a beacon, cutting through the freezing darkness, pulling her closer to her son. Her boots slipped on the icy ground, her flashlight beam bouncing wildly with her frantic pace. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Her boy was out there, and so was Shadow, their protector, their hope. Somewhere deep inside, she clung to a desperate belief that if Shadow was still barking, Max must still be alive. "Max!" she screamed, her voice cracking as tears streamed down her face. "Shadow! Max!" Behind her, Officer Reynolds and two other members of the search team struggled to keep up, calling out directions over their radios. The urgency in their voices was palpable. Every second mattered now. In the clearing, Shadow's body trembled with exhaustion, his breath coming in sharp, visible puffs against the icy air. But he didn't stop barking. He stood protectively over Max, his paws planted firmly in the snow despite the biting cold that had seeped deep into his body. Max was barely conscious, his tiny frame still pressed against the dog's side for warmth. Shadow nudged him gently with his nose, letting out a low whine as if to say, "Hold on, little one. Help is coming." Max stirred faintly, his lips trembling. "Shadow," he murmured, his voice so weak it was almost lost in the wind. He reached out with one small, trembling hand, his fingers brushing against Shadow's fur. The dog nuzzled him in response, his deep brown eyes scanning the dark woods for any sign of movement. And then, finally, he saw it, a flicker of light cutting through the trees. Rebecca's flashlight beam broke into the clearing, illuminating the scene before her. Max lying motionless in the snow, his face pale but alive, and Shadow standing guard over him, his black fur dusted with frost. For a moment, Rebecca froze, the weight of relief crashing over her like a wave. Then, with a choked sob, she dropped to her knees and scrambled toward them. "Max!" she cried, her voice breaking as she reached her son. She pulled him into her arms, cradling him against her chest. "Oh my God, Max baby, wake up. Please, wake up." Max's eyelids fluttered open, and a faint smile crossed his lips. "Mom," he whispered weakly. "Shadow," he stayed. Rebecca looked at the dog, her tear-streaked face filled with gratitude and disbelief. Shadow's body swayed slightly, his legs barely able to hold him up, but he wagged his tail faintly at the sound of Max's voice. "You saved him," Rebecca whispered, her voice trembling. "You didn't leave him. You stayed with him." Shadow let out a soft whine and finally allowed himself to collapse into the snow. Rebecca quickly reached out to stroke his head, her hand trembling. "You're a hero, Shadow. You're our hero." Behind her, Officer Reynolds and the rest of the search team arrived, their flashlights flooding the clearing with light. "We've got them," Reynolds called into his radio, his voice sharp with relief. "We've found the boy. He's alive." The officers moved quickly, wrapping Max in a thermal blanket and checking his vitals. "He's hypothermic, but his pulse is steady," one of them said, his tone brisk but reassuring. "We need to get him to the hospital immediately." Rebecca nodded, her arms never leaving Max as the officers helped her stand. "I'm coming with him," she said fiercely, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "What about the dog?" one of the officers asked, gesturing toward Shadow, who lay motionless in the snow, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Rebecca knelt beside him, her hand resting gently on his head. "He's coming too," she said firmly. "He's the reason my son is alive. I'm not leaving him behind." The officers exchanged a glance before one of them pulled out a second thermal blanket and carefully wrapped it around Shadow. The Labrador didn't resist, he was too exhausted to move. But even as the search team loaded him onto a stretcher alongside Max, Shadow's eyes flickered open just enough to glance at the boy. His tail wagged weakly, as if to say, "I'm still here." As the sled carried them back toward the road, Rebecca walked beside it, holding Max's hand in one of hers and keeping her other hand resting on Shadow's side. Her heart ached with gratitude and love for the dog who had risked everything for her son. And it was in this moment that Rebecca understood something profound. Shadow wasn't just their pet. He was their family, their healer, their guardian. This is a truth many of us have experienced with our own animals, especially as we grow older and begin to see just how much these creatures give back to us, often when we need it most. The ambulance was waiting when they reached the edge of the woods, its red and blue lights flashing against the snowy trees. Paramedics moved quickly, lifting Max and Shadow inside. Rebecca climbed in after them, refusing to let go of Max's hand. Shadow lay on the stretcher beside him, his body still and quiet, his eyes barely open. Rebecca stroked the dog's head as the ambulance sped toward Pine Hollow General Hospital. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Thank you for bringing my boy back to me." Shadow let out a soft sigh, his body relaxing for the first time all night. He had done his job. As the ambulance sped through the snowy streets, Rebecca's mind turned to the extraordinary bond between Max and Shadow. It was more than loyalty, it was a connection that had saved her son's life. Have you ever felt something similar with an animal in your life? Have they been there for you in ways no one else could? If so, take a moment to reflect on that. And if you want to understand how animals can bring healing, comfort, and even transformation to the lives of older adults, you'll want to keep watching. I'll share more about this at the end, and tell you how you can learn from stories like Shadows through our ebook, How Animals Transform Human Mental Health in the Third Age. By the time the ambulance reached the hospital, Rebecca's tears had stopped, replaced by a quiet determination. Shadow had given everything to save Max, and now it was her turn to make sure they both made it through. The soft hum of hospital equipment filled the room, a quiet rhythm of reassurance as Rebecca sat by Max's bed. Outside, the sun had risen on Christmas morning, casting golden light over the snowy landscape of Pine Hollow. But for Rebecca, this Christmas wasn't about presents or decorations. It was about gratitude. She sat silently, holding Max's small hand, her other hand resting on Shadow's head, who lay on the floor beside them. Both of them were safe now. Both of them were healing. Max was wrapped in thick blankets, his cheeks still pink from the frostbite but warm now, his tiny body slowly regaining strength. He stirred, his eyes fluttering open to find his mother watching him. A faint smile crossed his face. "Mom," he whispered, his voice hoarse but steady. "Is Shadow okay?" Rebecca's heart swelled. Even now, her son's first thought was for his dog. "He's okay, sweetheart," she said softly, stroking his hair. "He's tired, just like you, but he's going to be fine. You both are." On the floor next to Max's bed, Shadow stirred at the sound of his boy's voice. Though his body was still weak, his tail thumped faintly against the mat the nurses had set up for him. Max let out a small laugh at the sight, and Rebecca smiled, her tears of relief falling freely now. For the next few hours, Rebecca sat with them, barely leaving their side. Nurses and doctors came and went, checking on Max's frostbite and hypothermia, and a veterinary technician had been called in to treat Shadow. Everyone who entered the room seemed to pause, touched by the sight of the boy and his dog, two survivors who had endured the freezing wilderness together. And yet, there was something deeper happening here. It wasn't just that Shadow had saved Max's life, it was the bond between them, a bond rooted in loyalty, trust, and love. It's something that so many people with animals in their lives experience, especially in difficult moments. For Rebecca, it became clear that Shadow wasn't just Max's protector. He was a part of their healing. If you've ever felt like an animal understood you better than anyone else, you already know what I mean. It's these moments that remind us why the connection between humans and animals is so profound. By afternoon, the hospital room had grown warmer, not just from the sunlight pouring in through the windows, but from the quiet laughter shared between Rebecca and Max. Shadow was recovering faster than anyone expected, his energy returning bit by bit. Every so often, Max would reach down from his bed to stroke the Labrador's head, and Shadow's tail would wag in response. The bond between them seemed almost unshakable now, stronger than ever. Later that day, a knock came at the door. Officer Reynolds stepped into the room, holding a small box wrapped in red paper. His usually stoic face softened into a warm smile as he saw Max awake and alert. "Merry Christmas," he said, his deep voice quiet but kind. Rebecca rose to greet him, her voice trembling with emotion. "Officer Reynolds," she said, tears shining in her eyes. "I don't know how to thank you for everything you did. For helping us find him. For," she glanced down at Shadow, who was watching the officer with calm, trusting eyes. "For believing in Shadow." Reynolds nodded, his gaze shifting to the dog. "You don't need to thank me," he said gently. "The real hero is right there." He crouched down and reached into his pocket, pulling out a shiny gold medal attached to a blue ribbon. Max's eyes widened as Reynolds handed him the medal. "What's this?" Max asked, his voice small but filled with wonder. "It's for Shadow," Reynolds said with a smile. "For bravery. For saving you." Max beamed, tears welling up in his eyes as he looked at the medal, then at his dog. With his mother's help, he leaned over the bed and carefully placed the ribbon around Shadow's neck. The Labrador wagged his tail furiously, as if he understood the honor being bestowed upon him. "You're a hero," Max whispered, stroking Shadow's fur. "My hero." The room grew quiet, the weight of the moment settling over everyone present. Rebecca felt her chest tighten as she looked at her son and his dog, the two of them connected by something so much deeper than words could capture. It's a connection many people dream of having with their pets, a bond that doesn't just bring joy but can genuinely transform lives. Studies have shown how animals help us heal, bring us comfort, and even improve our mental health, particularly for older adults. Watching Max and Shadow, It was impossible not to think about how animals have the power to bring out the best in us, no matter our age. Over the next few days, Max and Shadow recovered together. Nurses would peek in to check on them, only to be greeted by the heartwarming sight of the boy and his dog curled up together. By the time New Year's Eve arrived, Max was strong enough to leave the hospital, and Shadow had returned to his usual self, wagging his tail with renewed energy. The town of Pine Hollow welcomed them home with open arms. Neighbors brought meals, flowers, and cards, each one inspired by the story of Shadow's incredible loyalty. Rebecca found herself overwhelmed by the outpouring of love, but nothing moved her more than the quiet moments between Max and Shadow. Wherever Max went, Shadow was close by, his unwavering devotion a constant reminder of the extraordinary bond they shared. One night, as they sat by the fire, Max looked up at his mother and said, "Mom, do you think Shadow knows how much I love him?" Rebecca smiled, her eyes glistening. "I think he's always known," she said softly. Max leaned down to wrap his arms around Shadow, who wagged his tail in response. "He's the best dog in the world," Max whispered. Rebecca watched them, her heart swelling. And it made her wonder, how many others could experience this kind of healing, this kind of love, if they only opened their lives to an animal? It's something that so many older adults miss out on: companionship, purpose, and a profound sense of connection. If you've ever wondered what animals could bring to your life, or the life of someone you love, there's a wealth of insight waiting for you. Spring had arrived in Pine Hollow, and with it, a renewed sense of life. The snow had melted into streams that trickled through the forest, and wildflowers stretched toward the sunlight. For Rebecca, Max, and Shadow, those dark, freezing hours of Christmas Eve had become a memory, a defining moment in their lives that bound them together even more deeply. Max was back to his bright, energetic self, his laughter filling the house as he ran through the backyard. And wherever Max went, Shadow followed, his black fur gleaming in the sunlight, his tail wagging constantly. The boy and his dog were inseparable, their bond stronger than ever, a bond that reminded everyone who knew them of the extraordinary love animals can bring into our lives. Rebecca often found herself sitting on the porch, watching Max and Shadow play. She couldn't help but think about everything Shadow had done to save her son. It wasn't just loyalty, it was love in its purest form. She had always known Shadow was special, but now she saw him as something more, a healer, a protector, and a true member of the family. And the more she thought about it, the more she began to understand the depth of what animals give to us. In ways both big and small, they change our lives. And it's not just for kids like Max. This bond can be life-changing for older adults as well. Pets offer companionship, reduce stress, and even help combat the loneliness that so many experience in their later years. One evening, Max sat quietly with Rebecca by the fireplace, Shadow curled up at their feet. "Mom," Max said softly, "do you think Shadow came to us for a reason? Like, maybe he was meant to be with us, to take care of me?" Rebecca smiled, reaching over to ruffle his hair. "I think so, sweetheart," she said. "I think Shadow was meant to remind us that we're never really alone, and that sometimes, the love of an animal is the greatest gift we can ever receive." Max leaned down to hug Shadow, his voice filled with emotion. "I love you, Shadow. You're my best friend." Rebecca wiped a tear from her eye, her heart full, and it made her wonder, how many other people could experience this kind of bond? How many people out there, especially older adults, might be missing out on the companionship and healing that an animal could bring into their lives? It was a question that stayed with her, and one that perhaps stays with you too. Stories like Max and Shadow's remind us of the incredible ways animals impact our lives, not just in extraordinary moments of heroism, but in everyday acts of loyalty, love, and understanding. If you've ever felt the quiet comfort of a pet by your side, or if you've ever wondered how animals can transform not only our lives but our mental health, I'd love to share something with you. Our ebook, How Animals Transform Human Mental Health in the Third Age, explores these powerful connections in depth. In this ebook, you'll discover the scientific benefits of having a pet in later life, heartwarming stories of how animals have transformed the lives of older adults, practical tips for introducing animals into your life or the life of someone you love. It's not just a book, it's a guide to understanding how animals bring healing, joy, and purpose into our lives. And whether you're already a pet lover or considering opening your home to an animal for the first time, this is your chance to explore the incredible ways they can help. So, if Max and Shadow's story touched your heart, don't let it end here. Click the link below to learn more about how animals transform human mental health in the third age. Let their story inspire you to create your own, a story of healing, connection, and unconditional love.